first graders, let's go ahead and finish chapter 5. It was not long before Howie led the parade into the kitchen again. He stopped so suddenly that the children bumped into one another. "When do we eat?" he demanded. "Now." Beezus thrust a dish of applesauce and a spoon into his hands. "I want some!" cried the others. Mother handed a second child some applesauce. "Forward march!" she ordered. Beezus led Howie into the living room, and the rest of the parade followed with her applesauce. "You sit here," she said to Howie, pointing to a place on the sheet. She was relieved to see that the others seated themselves around the edge of the sheet. Quickly, she handed around some paper napkins. "Hey, I want one with witches on it," demanded a boy who had a Valentine napkin. "I want one with hearts on it," wailed a girl who had a Halloween napkin. Beezus hastily counted the napkins. Yes, there were enough of each kind to go around. 2 napkins apiece would be safer anyway. She handed each child the second napkin, and they all began to eat their applesauce, except one little girl who didn't like applesauce. Ramona was beaming, because refreshments were the most important part of any party, and now at last her guests were behaving the way she wanted them to. Mother came out of the kitchen with the plates of Fig Newtons, which she handed to Beezus. "Here, pass these around," she said. "I think I'd better help Willa Jean." Willa Jean knew how to eat with a spoon. The trouble was she had to pick up the food with her left hand and put it into the spoon, which she held in her right hand. Then most of the time she was able to get it into her mouth. Ramona, her face shining with happiness, looked at her friends sharing the applesauce. "Those cookies are filled with worms, chopped up worms," she gleefully told everyone. "Why, Ramona," Beezus was shocked. "They aren't either. They're filled with ground up figs. You know that." Ramona did not answer. Her mouth was full of Fig Newtons. Beezus passed the plate to a boy named Joey. "I don't like worms," he said. I don't like worms either," said the next little girl, who had applesauce all over her chin. Beezus noticed that Ramona was beginning to scowl. When Howie refused a cookie, it was too much for Ramona. "You eat that," she shouted. "I won't," yelled Howie. "You can't make me." Ramona jumped up, spilling her applesauce on the sheet. She thrust a nibbled Fig Newton at Howie. "You eat that," she repeated as she stepped into the applesauce. "It's my party and I want you to eat it." Howie knocked the cookie out of her hand. Ramona grabbed a handful of Fig Newtons and thrust them at Susan. "Eat these," she shouted. Susan began to cry. "They're full of worms," she sobbed. "I don't like worms." "They're pretend worms," yelled Ramona. "No, they're not," cried Susan. "They're real." "You eat these," Ramona yelled, thrusting her handful of cookies at the children, who backed away. Ramona stamped her feet and screamed. Then she threw the Fig Newtons at her guests as hard as she could. "My mother won't let me eat worms," shouted a little boy. Ramona threw herself on the floor and kicked. "Ramona, stop that." Mother appeared from the kitchen and had Willa Jean balancing on one hip. She grabbed Ramona by one arm and tried to drag her to her feet, but Ramona's legs were like rubber. "All right, Howie, forward march," Beezus ordered, hoping to draw attention from Ramona. No one moved. It was much more fun to see what was going to happen to Ramona. "This is my party. They're supposed to eat my refreshments," Ramona howled, banging her heels on the floor. "Ramona, you're acting like a 2-year-old. You may go to your room and close the door until you can behave yourself," said Mother quietly. Ramona kicked harder to show that she was not going to mind unless she felt like it. "Ramona," said Mother even more quietly, "do not make me count to 10. Gasping with sobs, Ramona got up from the floor and ran into the bedroom, where she slammed the door as hard as she could. "All right, parade," said Mother wearily. "Forward march." Up and down, whistling, banging, tooting, marched the parade. Mother sat Willa Jean down and was just beginning to gather up the dishes and sheets when a car stopped in front of the house and Mrs. Kemp got out. "At last," sighed Mother, hurrying to the door. "I've come for Howie and Willa Jean," said Mrs. Kemp as several other cars stopped in front of the Quimby's. The parade marched into the living room. "I don't want to go home," protested Howie when he saw his mother. "The party must have been a success," Mrs. Kemp observed. "It certainly was." Mother tried to push the uncurled side of her hair behind her ear and smooth out her old rumpled dress. "I liked the parade," said Howie, "but I didn't like what they had to eat." "Why, Howie," scolded Mrs. Kemp, "we must remember our manners." Ramona's face streaked with tears. She came out of her room and stood staring unhappily at her departing guests. When the last child had struggled into his boots, she looked tearfully at her mother. "I'm behaving myself now," she said meekly. Mother dropped wearily into a chair. "Ramona, if you wanted a party, why didn't you ask me to have one?" Because when I ask, you don't let me do things, exclaimed Ramona, sniffing. Beezus couldn't help feeling that there was some truth in Ramona's remark. She had often felt that way herself, especially when she was younger. Mother, did I do things like Ramona when I was 4? She asked. You did some of the things Ramona does now, said Mother thoughtfully, but you were very different. You were quieter, for one thing. This pleased Beezus. One of the reasons she sometimes disliked Ramona was that she was never quiet when she could manage to be noisy. Of course, there are some things that all 4-year-olds do, Mother continued, but even sisters are usually different, just the way your Aunt Beatrice and I were different when we were girls. I was a bookworm and went to the library 2 or 3 times a week. She was the best hopscotch player and the fastest jump roper in the neighborhood, and she was better at jacks than anybody in our whole school. This surprised Beezus. She had never thought of her mother and Aunt Beezus as children before. She tried to picture her school teacher jumping rope and found to her surprise that it was not very hard to do. Of course, Mother and Aunt Beatrice must have been different when they were girls, because they were so different now when they were grown-ups, and she was glad they were different. She loved them both. Did I have tantrums too? Beezus asked. Once in a while, said Mother. I always dreaded cutting your fingernails because you kicked and screamed. Beezus could not help feeling silly. Imagine having a tantrum over a little thing like having your fingernails cut. Then Ramona spoke up. I don't cry when you cut my fingernails, she boasted. Yes, but you scream and you have your hair washed, Beezus could not help reminding her. Ramona, said Mother, you are a very naughty little girl this afternoon. What are we going to do with you? Ramona stopped sniffing and looked interested. Lock me in a closet for 1,000,000 years, she suggested cheerfully. Mother and Beezus exchanged glances. How quickly Ramona recovered. Make me sleep outdoors in the rain? Obviously, Ramona was enjoying herself. Not let me have anything to eat but carrots? Mother laughed and looked at Beezus. I'm afraid all we can do is wait for her to grow up, she said. And when Mother said we like that, Beezus almost felt sorry for Ramona because she would have to wait such a long time to be a grown-up. Tomorrow's chapter 6, is titled Beezuz's Birthday. See you tomorrow.